Zelensky didn't start this fight either. I'm Michael Smerconish in Philadelphia. You've seen the highlights. I recommend you watch it all. For 40 minutes yesterday in the Oval Office, there was a frank and civil exchange, and then it all hit the fan. It began when a Polish journalist asked President Trump, "What's your message for those who think you're too close to Putin?" And President Trump's response, in my opinion, totally appropriate. The former New York City real estate developer said he wasn't aligned with Putin, that he's aligned with America, that he's aligned with the world, that he's aligned with Europe, and that if he belittles Putin, he'll never be able to negotiate a deal, especially where President Zelensky's hatred for Putin is so evident. And then Trump called for one more question. But before the media could respond, Vice President J.D. Vance asked to be heard, or as the Wall Street Journal lead editorial today notes, he offered a, quote, odd interjection. He blasted former President Biden. He said the path to peace is through diplomacy. He noted that America has tried thumping its chest, but that approach had failed. Then President Zelensky responded with a brief history of Russian aggression in the last decade. Zelensky wanted it understood that Putin had violated agreements, that he continued to kill people, didn't honor a ceasefire, and didn't exchange prisoners as he had promised. "So what kind of diplomacy do you speak of, JD?" he then asked. And Vance turned the tables. After having started this debate, he changed the subject and said that it was unfair to litigate in front of the American media. And that was it. The tone shifted, the language grew sharp. President Trump took umbrage at Zelensky saying that the United States was protected by an ocean, but that it would feel pressure in the future. "You're in no position to dictate what we would feel," said Trump. "You don't have the cards," said Trump. "You're gambling with World War III, said President Trump. He then told Zelensky he was being disrespectful. And Vance chimed in and said, "You've not told us thank you." On one thing, all sides can sadly agree. Trump said that it would make for great television, and it was. I've watched the final 10 of the 50-minute presser 3 times. Each time I see something new. And soon after the Oval Office exchange, I watched live as Zelensky sat with Bret Baier on Fox News and answered some appropriate but sharp questions without flinching or offering an apology. Here's where I come out. Zelensky's a mensch. He's a stand-up guy with a Churchillian spine who's proven wrong those who said that an actor and comedian was unsuited to go toe-to-toe with Putin. He has, and he and his country are still standing. Yes, with the benefit of a lot of American support. Vance lit the fuse. He injected himself into the fray, made an argument, then cried foul when Zelensky offered a rebuttal. And Trump, seeing the spotlight turn toward his number 2 and a visiting head of state, took control and escalated the language. I don't like that Trump recently excluded Ukraine from the meeting with Russia in Saudi Arabia, or that Trump incorrectly blamed Zelensky for Russia's invasion. And Trump was wrong to say that Zelensky is a dictator while remaining silent on Putin. Plus, it was a disgrace. It was a disgrace on Monday that in a UN vote, the U.S. voted with Russia and North Korea instead of its European allies in refusing to blame Russia for starting the war. It's all rather embarrassing, unless it results in a deal. See, this is the true test of a transactional president. Can the art of the deal bring about the end of the war? I think it's offensive to ask Ukraine for reimbursement, backward-looking, for American aid. That sets a bad precedent, telling a friend threatened by an invading force and no friend of ours, well, we'll help you, but only for a price. If, however, there's a mineral deal to be struck in our mutual interest, let's do it. And if after striking that agreement, Trump can resolve a 3-year-old war in a way that Biden could not, and which protects Ukraine's sovereignty, I'll be the first to say this was all worth it. And maybe you deserve a Nobel Prize, Mr. President. But until then, I'm going to keep thinking that the bullying and the browbeating of the Ukraine president by the American president and vice president was unnecessary and out of bounds. One more thing occurs to me. Yesterday, a conservative journalist asked President Zelensky about his attire, noting that he wasn't wearing a suit. And this entire scene played out in an Oval Office that once again showcases a bust of Winston Churchill. There he is, by the way, between President Trump and Vice President Vance. Churchill, who, it should be noted, during World War II would often wear his famous siren suit, so-called because it could be slipped on and zipped up when air raid sirens went off. Yes, Churchill wore this even in the presence of foreign leaders and heads of state. There he is with General Eisenhower, future president of the United States. I want to know what you think. Go to my website at Smerconish.com. Answer today's poll question. Who bears the most responsibility for the Oval Office argument? Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, Volodymyr Zelensky, or all equally? Joining me now, CNN senior military analyst James Stavridis. He's the former Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, a retired four-star Navy admiral, a partner at the Carlyle Group, a global investment firm. He serves on the board of advisors for a handful of defense-related companies and is the author of a terrific book, The Restless Wave, a novel of the United States Navy. Admiral, I imagine you have seen many squabbles like this among world leaders and military leaders, but not on camera.
Yeah, you hit the right point. By the way, I agree with your analysis overall. I go back a decade ago when the NATO heads of state and government, including our President Barack Obama, who, by the way, his nickname was No Drama Obama. He knew enough to keep those kind of disagreements out of the photo spray at the top of the event. And he and other world leaders would go toe-to-toe with Hamid Karzai about how we were conducting the war in Afghanistan. Putting that all on display does neither side any good.
Can the European allies make up for a total collapse of U.S. support to Ukraine?
I think they can. It's a matter of will, not capacity, as follows. Europe's collective economy is 22% of the world's gross domestic product, just ahead of the United States at 25%. Really, Europe collectively and the U.S. are a matched pair of horses economically, pretty close. How big is Russia's economy? It's under 4%. So right out of the gates, the Europeans have 4 to 5 times more economic capacity. And how about military spending? Putin's spending about 150, 160 billion. Collectively, the Europeans, particularly now that their defense budgets are going up, are now approaching 4%, Michael. So certainly the capacity is there to do this. The question, which we'll learn more about this week, including tomorrow at a big meeting, we will learn more about the will that has to go alongside that capacity.
So read the tea leaves so far, because you know any number of European leaders have thus far voiced their standing with Ukraine in the aftermath of what transpired in the Oval Office yesterday. Any of that reaction noteworthy to Admiral James Stavridis?
Yeah, I think that the initial returns in the immediate aftermath of the bomb crater created by the meeting yesterday, the initial returns from the Europeans are sounding cautiously optimistic. I feel them starting to realize they're going to have to put the pack on here. Back to a wagon being pulled by 2 horses. If one of the horses just slips away, that other horse can keep pulling. You got to make sure it doesn't veer off in a bad direction as a result. It'll be led by Macron and Starmer, France and Britain. Look for the Poles to play an important role here. Look for the Baltics, who are small countries but mighty in their fear and detesting Russia. Look for the Swedes and the Finns, who have long bad history with Russia. I think there's plenty of will to go with that capacity. I think the Euros are going to step up here.
Okay, if the United States collapses its support for Ukraine, if it greatly diminishes what it's heretofore been doing for Ukraine, and if the Europeans don't fill the void, for how much longer can Ukraine hold out on the battlefield against Russia? How long can they go it alone?
They can't go it alone for any reasonable amount of time, but assuming the Europeans even continue their current level of aid, and let's do the numbers for a minute here. The U.S. thus far in 3 years has provided about 120 billion, call it 40 billion a year. The Europeans have provided in total all forms of aid, well more than that, 160 to 180 billion. So there will still be a lot of capacity going toward Ukraine. I'm going to assume that'll continue and even go up on the European side. In that scenario, I think the Europeans backing to the Ukrainians, I think Zelensky can hold out for an indefinite period. If the U.S. remains engaged, back to your scenario, I think that Donald Trump then has a chance at cutting a deal. And if he really wants to cut a deal, he's going to have to maintain some level of aid, kind of park the animosity. And oh, by the way, I imagine if you asked President Trump, was that the toughest moment in a negotiation? I bet he's seen some moments a lot angrier and a lot more difficult than that and gone on to eventually cut a deal. The key is we got to stay in this. Otherwise, what I really worry about, Michael, is the knock-on effect on the NATO alliance.
I hope that President Trump's leadership gets us to the right place, and I'm trying to give him every benefit of the doubt. I just don't like the way it looked yesterday. It's not how you treat a friend, the way that I was raised. Thank you, Admiral Stavridis. I appreciate you as always.